Well, it's 25 years ago when I did it. It's special to be part of something that's lasted 50 years.
As far as Hollywood stars go, Timothy Dalton is up there with the best of them, a man who was both right and wrong at the same moment. Even though he was the most brutal, realistic, and true to the original James Bond, audiences rejected him. While Daniel Craig got a lot of credit for playing a serious, grounded Bond, the reality is that Timothy Dalton had tried the same thing 20 years before to mixed reviews. Why did he, a talented actor, just make 2 appearances as Bond before disappearing? Despite attracting the attention of several famous women, why has he never tied the knot? Was the man hiding behind his charming facade an introvert who shied away from commitment and the spotlight? The public wasn't prepared to accept Timothy Dalton's Bond, who was more authentic than ever before, and maybe that was their worst error. The American-born Timothy Dalton came from a mixed-race household and was born on March 21, 1946 in Quin Wales. Although he lived the majority of his youth in England, Dalton was legally a U.S. citizen thanks to his American mother and his disciplined and ethical father, who had been a British intelligence officer in the Special Operations Executive (SOE) during World War II. Even though he came from an intelligent family, Dalton never saw himself as a star-crossed Broadway performer. Like his father, he aspired to be a powerful man, a soldier, a pilot, or perhaps a real-life spy. Since Dalton was always more drawn to a life of order, accuracy, and practicality, no one ever thought he'd end up an actor. Dalton planned to join the military or work in aerospace when he was a youngster, so he enrolled in an air cadet training program. He had always wanted to be an astronaut and take part in space exploration, whether it was above or below Earth's atmosphere. That was the road Dalton had always imagined for himself, but destiny had different ideas. Seeing Shakespeare's Macbeth at a theater was a life-changing experience for young Dalton. All of a sudden, everything began to shift. It was all too much for him, the word's force, the stage's intensity of emotion, and the actor's ability to control the room with his voice alone. Allured by tales larger than himself, he found himself engrossed in the realm of Shakespeare and play. His aspirations of becoming a pilot, soldier, or intelligence officer vanished in that split second. This, Dalton knew, was his destiny, a road paved with triumph and adorned with mysteries he had yet to unravel. Timothy Dalton did not squander any time following his new direction after the tragic shock of learning about Shakespeare. He was admitted to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, RADA, one of England's most esteemed acting institutions, when he was 18 years old. But Dalton was impatient and didn't want to wait around. He wanted to do things right now. He didn't think twice about dropping out of RADA before finishing his course before long. Dalton took a deliberate action, even though it may have been hazardous. He became a member of the National Theatre and spent his time there performing in world-renowned productions of classic plays. Dalton came out on top in no time. The young man's imposing stature, intense gaze, and powerful voice made him an ideal candidate for the stage of Shakespearean theater. This was more than simply a gifted performer. Reviewers and audiences alike were enthralled by his potential. He became one of the most famous actors in Britain with his performances in Henry IV, Macbeth, and Romeo and Juliet. As if everything had been orchestrated beforehand, the movie doors swung open. In 1968, Dalton got the part of King Philip II of France in The Lion in Winter, which marked the defining moment when major directors began paying notice to him. Even though the picture had a brilliant ensemble that included Anthony Hopkins, Katharine Hepburn, and Peter O'Toole, Dalton was not overshadowed in the least. Actor Timothy Dalton was always an outsider. He defied convention. He became one of the most iconic personalities in 1970s film while avoiding safe assignments and never pursuing stardom. Dalton was formerly one of Britain's most promising cinema actors after 1968's The Lion in Winter. However, in order to be remembered for his acting prowess, one must make a distinct impression, and Dalton took an unconventional route. Rather than focusing on mainstream parts, he embraced films that delved into complicated psychological themes where he could unleash his piercing eyes and authoritative voice to depict multi-layered, troubled characters. As the aristocrat Prince Rurt, Dalton was swept up in the tumultuous power struggles of the English Civil War in the 1970 historical drama Cromwell. Henry Darnley, Queen Mary's tragically tragic husband, played by him in Mary, Queen of Scots, 1971, was an endearing protagonist with tragic ambitions. This was a watershed point in Dalton's career. In Wuthering Heights, 1970, he played Heathcliff, a tortured soul caught between love and retribution. At that moment, viewers recognized Timothy Dalton as more than simply an actor. He was an artist. Dalton transformed into Heathcliff, not only a Heathcliff. Despite his stellar reputation, Dalton was still in search of a character that captivated audiences with its allure, intrigue, peril, and tremendous emotion. Finally, that year, 1983, came. In Jane Eyre, Timothy Dalton as the mysterious romantic Edward Rochester. His Rochester was not your stereotypical dashing gent. Rather, he was passionate, mysterious, icy at times, and brimming with desire. His profound, incisive voice captivated listeners with each word and glance he made. Along with the film's financial success, Dalton was solidified as an iconic figure in the world of cinematic romance. At the Royal Theatre in 1986, Timothy Dalton and Vanessa Redgrave, the lady he had previously loved so much, were performing together. In Shakespeare's realm, where words had great power and the spotlights illuminated every detail, he truly belonged. A life-altering phone call from Eon Productions, though, altered everything. They saw his casting as James Bond, one of the most famous actors of all time, as a monumental chance and a must-do turning moment in his career. On the other hand, it made Dalton wonder if this was the biggest trap that Hollywood had ever laid for him. Actually, Dalton had heard of James Bond before. When Sean Connery initially stood down following You Only Live Twice in 1968, he was already being courted for the part. Producers thought Dalton, a young actor, could continue Sean Connery's work, but he turned them down. And why? Just 22 years old was he. George Lazenby's disastrous performance as James Bond is well known. Dalton felt that Bond had to be an experienced man. He couldn't be a clumsy young lad in a tuxedo. However, that was not the last chapter. Dalton was considered again in 1971, when Connery departed for a second time following Diamonds Are Forever. Roger Moore, nevertheless, was a radical departure for the makers. He was a charming, comical, and light-hearted Bond. Bond became very different from Ian Fleming's initial idea as the series veered onto a more fun and extravagant path. Dalton was once again disregarded. Roger Moore was contemplating resigning in 1981 when he was about 54 years old. Moore opted to remain for a couple more years, filming Octopussy and For Your Eyes Only, even though Dalton's name reappeared again. Once again, Dalton blew his chance. A View to a Kill, released in 1985, was Moore's last Bond film. Dalton was formally named the fourth James Bond in cinematic history, and fate was no longer hesitating. Little did anybody know that this choice would be the beginning of the end for his career as well. Unlike Connery and Moore, Dalton never intended to portray James Bond in the traditional sense when he assumed the role. Instead of a flamboyant hero, he aspired to return the character to Ian Fleming's original conception of him as a chilly, wounded agent. Dalton devoted months to studying Bond's psychology, reading all of Bond's novels, and researching the source material. He hoped that viewers would perceive Bond as more than simply a womanizer who makes jokes while on the run. His unwavering will allowed him to bring a fresh 007 to life in The Living Daylights, 1987. The plot was strong, the picture did okay at the box office, and critics gave it good reviews. However, viewers weren't prepared for this particular Bond. They had become accustomed to an endearing, amusing 007 for more than 10 years. One who could smile mischievously while killing a guy with one hand. Dalton refrained from doing it, as well as from flirting with Roger Moore and smirking after action sequences. Audiences were uneasy because he was a serious, realistic Bond, even cruel at times. His next Bond picture, 1989's License to Kill, was darker, grittier, and more violent than his previous work. He returned 2 years later. Bond wasn't only completing a task, he was out for blood. A Bond conflicted between doing what's right and satisfying his own desires. A Bond unafraid to murder. Audiences thought the picture deviated too far from the stereotypical James Bond. A true horror befell the Bond series shortly after, so Dalton never got the chance to prove his point. The company that distributed the Bond films, MGM, was involved in a legal dispute with Eon Productions in 1990, which caused the next Bond film to be postponed indefinitely. At the same time, Dalton was bound to wait since he was still under contract with the studio. He remained indebted to Eon's upper management, which prevented him from assuming additional significant jobs. He remained stuck for over 5 years, unable to fully embody either Bond or anybody else. By 1993, once MGM had finally settled its legal issues, they had planned to relaunch the franchise in a more commercial and mainstream setting. They want Dalton's return, but this time, they wanted a long-term deal that would tie him to more than one Bond picture. For Dalton, this meant serving time in prison. By that point, he had wasted too much time and missed too many chances to reprise Bond, and the character no longer resonated with him. The news of Timothy Dalton's retirement from the James Bond role was formally confirmed on April 12, 1994. Pierce Brosnan was revealed as the new Bond just 2 months later. And in 1995, the Bond series entered a sparkling new era with the worldwide success GoldenEye. Brosnan had the charisma of Connery and the grace of Moore, but he kept the role's seriousness just right, evoking the gravity that Dalton had brought to it before. He was a Bond who was lovely enough to win over people, but not too different from Fleming's original character to be condemned. As Brosnan reveled in the limelight, Dalton almost vanished from the Hollywood scene. Dalton later claimed that he had never been fond of the notion of playing the part for too long when asked if he regretted leaving Bond. Actually, though, his leaving was the last straw that broke his career. He went on to star in a sparse assortment of TV series and independent films in the years that followed. After his Bond role, he never got another one of such caliber. The story's biggest irony may have occurred 20 years later, in 2006, when Daniel Craig made his acting debut in Casino Royale. The same attributes that fans had panned in Timothy Dalton, realism, ruthlessness, and a depth of character, were suddenly lauded in his Bond. Maybe Dalton wasn't an unsuccessful Bond, but rather an innovative Bond. Is the unanswered issue that viewers weren't prepared for James Bond the sole reason Hollywood missed up on the ideal candidate? Despite his reputation for playing mysterious, aloof, and haughty males on television, Timothy Dalton was once a deeply in love man. An exquisite and sad love tale unfolded between a guy who shied away from commitment and a woman who yearned for a genuine family. It was more than simply a casual affair. It did not end happily ever after, as do many passionate but troubled relationships. While filming Mary, Queen of Scots in 1971, Dalton crossed paths with Vanessa Redgrave. He was a 25-year-old actor and she was 34, a famous actress with a long career, a husband, and children of her own. A strong, independent woman who stood in stark contrast to the carefree, youthful women who usually accompanied Hollywood's leading men. Regardless of their age difference or social status, Dalton was captivated by Vanessa's feisty nature from the start, and not for her renown or attractiveness. Vanessa Redgrave was completely unique. She was fiercely independent and proud, and she wouldn't back down from a fight. Dalton was the type of man who would follow her no matter the cost. He never shied away from a challenge. They started dating in a way that was very unconventional. Despite having a family of her own, Vanessa did not reject Dalton. The flames of their love were kindled swiftly and burned brightly, devouring them completely. They got through the ups and downs of the film industry as a team, performed together, and stood shoulder to shoulder on stage. Still, they were never married. That didn't matter much at first, since they were just two free-spirited artists who weren't going to conform to anyone's expectations. Their divergent goals and outlooks on life became apparent, though, as time went on. In her heart, Vanessa yearned for a genuine family. She yearned to establish a permanent connection with Dalton via procreation. Contrary to popular belief, Dalton had no interest in getting married. He rejected the idea of everlasting love and the responsibilities that came with homeownership. What tore them apart was his desire for love but his reluctance to commit. They were hopelessly stuck in love for more than 10 years. Even for the woman he loved most, Dalton was adamant about living life his way and not bending to anybody else's expectations. Dalton, meantime, could never provide Vanessa with the certainty she needed. When their disagreements grew insurmountable, they ultimately decided to split ways. Just two individuals who could not continue down the same road together. No drama, controversy, or messy litigation, unlike many Hollywood breakups. Dalton, who had a history of avoiding commitment, retreated to his world while Vanessa pursued her job and created her own life. But then, as fate would have it, Dalton would find himself entangled in yet another passionate romance, one that would not only end in separation, but also treachery. Dalton met the stunning young Russian singer and pianist Oksana Grigorieva in 1995 when he was about 50 years old. She had the enigmatic beauty and captivating charisma of Eastern Europe, yet she was over 20 years younger than him. Above everything else, though, Oksana was not Vanessa Redgrave. She was no strong, independent actress who dared to question him. She was a stage lady. Rather, she captivated him by making him feel like the focus of attention, a strong guy capable of protecting a vulnerable lady. Their passionate, fast-paced affair looked to be diametrically opposed to Dalton's previous relationships. He was able to maintain control with Oksana, in contrast to Vanessa, who forced him to choose between his independence and the expectations of a powerful woman. He had no qualms about committing to love, but Dalton still wouldn't go down the aisle, no matter how idyllic the circumstances. Despite the intensity and passion of their love, Dalton never stopped being himself, a guy who refused to be tied down by anybody. He maintained his position even after Oksana became pregnant with their son. Alexander was born to them in 1997. Even though Dalton and Oksana never tied the knot, he was a doting father who made sure his child had all he needed. Despite his repeated claims that Alexander was his life's greatest blessing, he never married her. With intense love, no marriage or responsibilities, only wanton freedom, it seems like a recipe Dalton could believe in indefinitely. Yet he was mistaken. Oksana was unfaithful and did not wait like Vanessa. Eventually, it all came crashing down. The media was abuzz with murmurs and rumors that Oksana was seeing Peter Blomqvist, a Swedish businessman who supposedly had everything to give her. Marriage, opulence, and the stability she sought were never in Dalton's agenda. Dalton did not protest or plead when the reports came true. He knew. He had anticipated this for quite some time. You can't expect loyalty from a man who doesn't believe in commitment. Keeping his dignity intact but bearing a scar greater than any role he had ever performed, he subtly severed ties with the woman. It was Dalton's refusal to let his resentment influence his kid, nevertheless, that truly distinguished him. Even though he was betrayed by a woman, Dalton stayed a loyal parent, unlike many men. The narrative appeared to have come to an end. Yet he continued to support Alexander, spend time with him, and remain loyal to the mother of his child, even after his relationship with Oksana ended. However, Oksana Grigorieva had more in store. Just a few years down the road, she was entangled in another high-profile romance, this time with Mel Gibson, a major player in Hollywood's power couple scene. In contrast to her amicable split with Dalton, this romance became embroiled in a major controversy that rocked the entertainment community. Gibson was unexpectedly accused of domestic violence by Oksana, who gave birth to their daughter Lucia in 2009. She proceeded to get a restraining order and claimed that he had brutally attacked her. There was more to come. The public was shocked by leaked audio recordings. In addition to making blatantly racist comments, Gibson was heard threatening to murder Oksana. The involvement of law enforcement led to Gibson's arraignment in court. He ended up with a 3-year probationary term, a counseling order, and community service requirements. The controversy almost ruined his career. Gibson fell from grace after becoming a top-tier Hollywood star, losing multi-million-dollar agreements and the approval of many of his colleagues. In the middle of all this mayhem, there was still one weird fact. Timothy Dalton was the only guy who had ever loved Oksana without criticizing her in any way. He refrained from going to court or making public appearances denouncing her in the same way that Mel Gibson did. He quietly departed, maintaining his composure and fulfilling his role as a father. Upon reflection, I can't help but wonder if Dalton was really betrayed, or if he had just set himself up to be the kind of man who would always be left behind because he didn't believe in commitment, but yet wanted devotion. No matter what happens, one thing is certain. Timothy Dalton is still alone after losing his 2 biggest loves. And maybe that was his life's plan all along. The story of Timothy Dalton exemplifies a timeless tragedy in Hollywood, a trailblazer who was overshadowed by those who came too soon. Even if he returned James Bond to Ian Fleming's original concept, viewers still didn't like him. Fans were ecstatic when Daniel Craig's portrayal of James Bond, grittier, colder, and more grounded, came out 20 years later. However, Dalton really accomplished this in the 1980s. The only problem was that nobody was prepared to hear him then. Not only do Dalton's fans feel this way, but some of the most brilliant brains in film have spoken out about it as well. One of the most lauded directors of the modern era, Christopher Nolan, has lauded Dalton as the Bond character most reminiscent of Fleming's writings. Nolan went so far as to say that he wanted to helm a Bond picture in the vein of Dalton because he thought that was the most authentic portrayal of the character. Tragically, Dalton's narrative is about how invention was underestimated. They could have called License to Kill a masterpiece if it had come out in the early 2000s instead of 1989. However, Dalton was overshadowed by the debut of the film, which occurred while viewers were engrossed on Roger Moore's comedic interpretation of the role. People started to look back and see that Timothy Dalton wasn't a failure. He was just ahead of his time, and that didn't happen until Daniel Craig became successful. However, Dalton's impact extended beyond Bond. Despite Hollywood's disregard, he remained steadfast. Following this, Dalton's acting chops kept getting better and better. He proved he was more than simply an actor with a single famous character by refusing to be defined by Bond. Penny Dreadful, a gothic horror series, was his last major television role, and he made a lasting impression with his incredibly nuanced and complex performance. Bringing the breadth and depth of a legendary career to the big screen, this was no longer the youthful Shakespearean actor nor the icy calculating 007. This was an experienced performer. Playing the character of the Chief, a shadowy and slightly evil person in the DC universe, Dalton proved once again that he could elevate even the most out-there parts to iconic status in Doom Patrol. Dalton could captivate audiences with his acting chops alone. He needed neither to be James Bond nor a Hollywood A-lister. His most surprising contribution may have originated in an animated picture. Few people noticed that Timothy Dalton was in the Oscar-nominated masterwork Toy Story 3 when it came out and became a worldwide sensation. Despite the film's apparent departure from Dalton's usual fare, he still managed to make an impression on one of the most beloved films of the decade. So what exactly is Timothy Dalton's lasting impact? Is he a lost Bond, a Hollywood reject, or a forgotten icon whose worth is only now being recognized? Maybe Dalton was never one to seek attention. He had no interest in becoming the type of Hollywood celebrity that the industry craved. All he wanted was to act and give his all to the profession. Maybe in retrospect, Timothy Dalton will be remembered not as the Bond who slipped between the cracks, but as the one who paved the way for everything that came after. Who cares if Dalton was successful or not? What matters more is if anyone will see the big picture and realize he was successful a long time ago. Dalton has never tied the knot at the age of 79, in contrast to many of his contemporaries who have found happiness in marriage or domestic bliss. Like his on-screen persona had predetermined his destiny, he is unique among James Bonds in that he has never been married or otherwise tied down. However, Dalton is not a victim of tragedy who is shackled to his solitary. Rather, he has made his loneliness his life's work. Not a single scandal, social media post, or participation at a glitzy event. As he proceeds at his own speed in the middle of the industry's mayhem, always maintaining a measured distance from the limelight, he finds satisfaction in simpler yet profoundly personal pursuits, fishing in the Pacific, listening to jazz, and collecting rare antiques, rather than Hollywood's extravagant parties. Dalton and his sole son Alexander, whom he has with American-born Oksana Grigorieva, have stayed away from the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, but they have stayed close. Alexander is now 28 years old. Even though Alexander and his dad no longer reside in the same house, they are very close and keep in touch often, seeing each other whenever they can. The one thing that matters most to Dalton is Alexander. His commitment as a father has never faltered, even if he is not married. Surprisingly, Dalton has managed to keep things friendly with Oksana Grigorieva, even if they have a rocky history together. There is a complete absence of animosity, hostility, and public feuds such as the ones that transpired between Oksana and Mel Gibson throughout her legal dispute with Gibson. In a society where controversy and anger often tear marriages apart, Dalton openly defended her, saying that they had moved past it and that what mattered most was their son's future. Dalton has always stood out from other Hollywood leading men because to his ability to maintain composure and dignity under pressure. Dalton isn't one to often go out of his shell, although fans of Manchester City may get a glimpse of him at the stadium on occasion. He may no longer play James Bond in films, but he maintains the poise of a true English gentleman and does not need approval from anybody to live his life as he pleases. Maybe this is the ideal portrayal of Timothy Dalton, a free spirit unbound by conformity yet never overwhelmed by isolation. Even though he was ignored by Hollywood, he was never dependent on them to determine his value. Although spectators weren't prepared for Timothy Dalton's James Bond role, he would go on to get accolades and recognition in subsequent years. He wasn't the most financially successful Bond, but he was definitely one of the most memorable. A pioneer who was misunderstood, a guy whose principles were unshakable, and who never settled for conformity or the approval of others. Instead, he followed his own path. He stayed true to himself, even after he turned down marriage and the glitz of Hollywood. Dalton, a genuine lone wolf, maintained his character as a frigid but dignified gentleman in a world where everything is continually changing. Maybe if people back then had paid more attention, Timothy Dalton would not have been a fading icon but the best James Bond of all time. Hollywood may forget Dalton, but Bond aficionados will never forget that he set the stage for the rest of the series. Timothy Dalton. What are your thoughts about him? Were we misled into thinking he was the perfect Bond? Put your ideas down below. In order to ensure that you don't miss any more intriguing content, please like and subscribe. Perhaps after rewatching The Living Daylights and License to Kill, you will come to the realization that Timothy Dalton was never a forgotten Bond, but rather an actor whose greatness was overlooked.